If nothing else, we can at least say that Russian President Vladimir Putin has a plan when it comes to the Ukraine war: feed thousands of his soldiers into a meat grinder of his own creation. Putin has turned the war into one of attrition, with his strategy being to send wave after wave of his own people to their deaths against Ukraine's defenses. His goal is simple: the more people that Putin sends, the more ammunition those sentient pieces of cannon fodder soak up. Eventually, a Ukrainian fortification will exhaust its ammunition, forcing a withdrawal and some gained ground for Russia at the cost of potentially thousands of the country's men. Hey, we only said it was a plan. We didn't say it was a good one. And it's a strategy that's wreaking havoc on Russia and its demographics. The numbers are in, and we can see exactly what Putin's bullheaded and tactically inept approach to the Ukraine war has done to his country's population. Russia has lost an entire percent of its male population since Putin began his special military operation. That's massive for so many reasons, from keeping the Ukraine war going to what it'll mean for Russia when the war is finally over. In this video, we're going to dig into the figures, explain what they mean for Russia, and why this is just such terrible news for Putin. Let's start with the raw numbers. In July 2024, the Kyiv Independent published a report in which it suggested that the rate of Russian casualties in Ukraine was far higher than the Kremlin let on. It cited leaked documents from the US Department of Defense, which suggested that Russia's casualty rate was likely between 462,000 and 728,000 soldiers killed, injured, or captured from the battlefields of Ukraine. If accurate, the numbers would exceed the cumulative casualties Russia has experienced in every war it's fought since World War II, and up to the beginning of Putin's special military operation. The figures also surpass what Russia claims it was losing at the time. According to both Mediazona and Medusa, which are Russian state media outlets, Russia had only seen 120,000 of its soldiers killed in Ukraine between February 2022 and the beginning of July 2024. At the same time, Ukraine's own general staff was estimating over 500,000 Russians were casualties. For context, there were believed to be between 3 and 4 Russians wounded for every 1 killed in Ukraine. Quoting a similar article published by The Economist, the Kyiv Independent says, "The latest estimates suggest that roughly 2% of all Russian men aged between 20 and 50 may have been either killed or severely wounded in Ukraine since the start of the full-scale war. The most severe of these losses were among the male group between the ages of 45 and 49, showing that Putin's tactic of sending older reserves into the Ukraine war was paying off with more deaths. Men aged between 35 and 39 weren't faring much better. Around 27,000 soldiers from this age group had died in Ukraine by the summer of 2024. If we assume the 3 to 4 times injury rate is accurate, that will also mean that between 81,000 and 108,000 men in this age bracket had suffered injury in Ukraine up to the same period. And it's only gotten worse from there. Bear in mind that these figures came from midway through 2024. We've had half a year of fighting, with Russia also renewing its push in the Donetsk region and dealing with Ukraine's invasion of Kursk since then. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, Russia's casualty rate now stands at 806,500 people, the vast majority of them being men. So now we get to the maths. In 2021, the year before Putin launched his special military operation, Russia's population was 147.2 million. That population was split unevenly between men and women, with 0.86 men for every woman. We also need to exclude children from this list. In 2022, let's estimate that about 23.21% of Russia's population was under 18 years old, which amounts to approximately 33,555,111 children. We'll use this figure to subtract from the total 2022 population to give us approximately 111,158,203. We need to dig down into the male population figures. Dividing the 111,158,203 total by 2, which is the number of groups we're considering, gives us 55,579,101.5. But remember, there are 0.86 men for every woman in Russia. So we multiply the 55,579,101.5 by 0.86 to give us a pre-war male population of approximately 47,779,487. Up to 806,500 of those men are now dead, injured, or captured. That means that approximately 1.6% of Russia's male population has been decimated in Ukraine. The numbers don't get much better if we bring children back into the mix. Dividing the total 2021 Russian population by 2 gives us 72,967,013.5. We then multiply that by 0.86 to get approximately 62,781,892 men and boys. meaning we still have more than 1% of Russia's male population as casualties of the Ukraine war, assuming the country's Ministry of Finance is publishing accurate figures. That's massive, and if the last couple of months are any indication, Russia's losses show no sign of slowing down. If anything, they're speeding up as Putin pushes to take more territory in Donetsk while he's trying to retake what Russia lost in Kursk. In the last 2 months of 2024, Russia has experienced record-breaking losses multiple times over. Take November as an example. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, Russia suffered 45,680 casualties in that month alone. That made November 2024 the single most deadly month for Russian men in the Ukraine war since it began, with the numbers being up almost 4,000 from the 41,980 casualties in October. Russia had a daily average casualty rate of 1,523, with November also delivering the first day in which Russia lost over 2,000 of its men. The daily high of 2,030 was another record breaker for Russia. December would deliver even more broken records. In that month, Russia suffered an enormous 48,670 casualties, marking the 6th consecutive month in which the country's monthly loss rate increased. December's numbers were also a 3,000-man increase on the November figures. Plus, Russia broke its record for daily casualties again, and it lost 2,200 men on December 19, 2024. Imagine for a moment that this type of casualty rate continues throughout 2025. If we take the midway point between November and December figures, we get about 47,000 casualties per month. Multiply that by 12, and you get another 564,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in Ukraine for 2025. That would bring the total figure up to around 1.35 million Russian casualties, enough to put Russia's adult male population loss to over 2% of its pre-war figures. There are no two ways around these numbers for Russia. Putin's meatgrinder approach to the war, after his initial intended 5-day flash invasion during the first week of the conflict, has had a massive toll on the country. And even if you account for the many international mercenaries and the 12,000 North Koreans Putin has welcomed into his military's fold, you still get more than 1% of Russia's adult male population being decimated by Putin's special military operation. That brings us to the obvious question: what does this mean for Russia in the future, both during the war and upon its conclusion? For one, Russia finds itself in the extremely rare position of its male death rate now surpassing its birth rate, at least on the daily level. Typically, this only happens to a country when it's at war, especially an attritional one like Putin is waging, or if the country is racked by a devastating disease that's wiping out large portions of the population. This birth rate issue has been a problem for Russia since at least the midpoint of November 2024. That's when Newsweek reported on Russia's November 11th one-day death toll of 1,950, another record, though one that was broken later in the month and has since been broken again in December. Newsweek also shared male birth rate data from 2022, which accounts for most of the first year of the Ukraine war. In that year, Russia had 670,200 boys born, amounting to a total of 1,836 per day. Thus, the 1,950 casualties on November 11th were over 100 males higher than this birth rate. And we know there have been several days since where Russia has broken the 2,000 barrier, leading to several hundred more men dying or being wounded in Ukraine than were being born in Russia in 2022. Full figures for Russia's birth rate in 2024 aren't available yet, but we do have numbers for the first half of that year. And with a little more maths, we can figure out what those numbers mean in the context of Russia's declining male birth rate. According to data published by the statistics service Rosstat, Russia recorded just 599,600 births during the first months of 2024. That was 16,000 fewer than the same period in 2023, and the lowest Russia had experienced since 1999. If we multiply that birth rate figure by 2, we get an approximate 1,119,200 births for the full year. This time, we're not using the same male-to-female ratio we have for Russia's existing population. Instead, we use Russia's ratio of males to females at birth, which is 1.06 males to every 1 female. Taking that into account, we divide out total births by 2 and multiply the result by 1.06 to get an approximate figure for the number of male babies born in Russia in 2024. 635,576, which means a little under 35,000 fewer male babies than were born in 2022. That casts the Newsweek figures into a brand new light. Using the 2022 numbers, we can see that Russia's male death rate only exceeds its male birth rate on a limited number of days, often those on which it breaks its daily casualty rate record for the Ukraine war. But if we assume 635,576 boys were born in 2024 based on these figures, that gives us a daily male birth rate of 1,741.3. There are now plenty more opportunities for Russia's daily casualty rate in Ukraine to exceed its daily birth rate for male children. There is some light at the end of the tunnel for Putin and his people. We estimated earlier that Russia's casualty rate in 2025 will be 564,000 if it maintains the monthly loss rates it's experienced towards the end of 2024. That would at least mean that Russia gets a net gain of 71,576 boys for 2025, assuming the 2024 figures hold steady. Granted, those are all boys who won't be able to enter the Ukraine war for another 18 years, all while older and able-bodied men are dying around them. And worse yet for Putin, it's all adult men who are dying in Ukraine. These are all men who won't be able to come back home and procreate once the war is over. So if we're seeing Russia deal with a declining birth rate now, it's only going to get worse the longer the Ukraine war drags on. And even when the war is over, it'll take decades for Russia's current male population to come of age and start having children of their own. Putin has created a multi-decade population deficit in his country, and that brings us to another problem. Russia has lost more than 1% of its adult male population at a time when it's already in the midst of a demographic crisis that threatens to shatter the entire country's identity. Several outlets, including Fortune and the Atlantic Council, have dedicated column inches to the major demographic crisis in Russia right now. Fortune points to the same birth rate figures as Newsweek and Reuters, in addition to sharing a quote from Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov when referring to the birth numbers for the first half of 2024. "This is catastrophic for the future of the nation," Peskov said in July 2024. "The birth rate is now at a terribly low level, 1.4 births per woman. That's comparable to many other European countries and nations like Japan, which themselves have lower than traditional birth rates. But when you apply those figures to Russia, a country that's always relied on manpower, especially during wartime, you get a national crisis." The reality for Putin is that his country was trending toward a demographic crisis several years before he launched his special military operation. The Kremlin was already offering better access to childcare for low-income families and increased tax breaks for those who had children before the war started. With mortality rates spiking thanks to the war, those minor benefits are likely seen as nothing to write home about for the potential families that remain in Russia. And there's another problem. On top of losing 1% of its male population in Ukraine, Russia has also lost hundreds of thousands who fled the country when Putin invaded Ukraine. The numbers vary depending on the source, with Al Jazeera putting it at about 1 million who fled between 2022 and 23, with the UK's Ministry of Defence saying it was likely closer to 1.3 million. That could mean anywhere between 500,000 and 700,000 Russian males left their country, many never to return, even before Russia lost over 800,000 of them on the battlefield. It all keeps feeding into that demographic crisis. The situation is compounded by the terrible economic conditions being created in Russia by the war, more on those later, and the overall shortfall in Russia's population. Extreme measures may be needed to rectify the demographic problem. Writing for the Atlantic Council, international affairs expert Harley Balser said, "Unless Russia's leaders can develop and finance a more effective set of policies, the only solutions to population decline will be a combination of incorporating non-Russian territory and/or immigration from Asia and Africa." Putin is obviously already trying to do the former with his invasion of Ukraine. Perhaps he hopes he can win the war in enough time to have Ukraine's own battered population prop up Russia's demographic numbers. As for welcoming more immigrants into Russia, that could lead to higher birth rates, though they would come at the cost of those birth rates being to non-nationals. If Putin takes that approach, Balzer argues, he might end up with a Russia without any Russians. An extreme scenario perhaps, but it's a statement that underpins just how devastating the loss of over 1% of its male population in Ukraine could be to Russia's national identity. Putin already knows that Russia has a demographic problem. He's known this since he took office as president almost a quarter of a century ago. Since then, Balzer says, Russia's leader has pumped trillions of rubles into what he calls national projects to raise Russia's population, all to mixed results. Of course, his latest national project is to take Ukraine by any means necessary. And it's a project that has undergone all the progress his others might have achieved. And that brings us back to something we mentioned earlier, Russia's economy. Put yourself in a potential Russian family's shoes. You're considering having children, but there are already so many factors working against you. The man of the family could be called away to war at any time, especially if Putin decides that a second round of mobilization is a must to keep up with the war's massive churn rate. But even if you can avoid military service, you're still living in a country where wartime industry is the main economic driver. Interest rates are sky high, with inflation also being a massive problem. The cost of living without children is already high enough for you to be struggling, never mind adding a child into the mix. Would you really think that now is the time to have children? The odds are you wouldn't, regardless of Russia losing over 1% of its male population. And you wouldn't be alone, as Russia's economic issues stemming from Putin's invasion are actively hurting the Russian people. Of course, Putin is taking his usual heavy-handed approach to the problem. According to Semaphore, he's made it illegal for anybody in Russia to advocate a child-free lifestyle. regardless of the benefits it brings to couples that are ailing financially. Any advocates for not having children that Russia finds face fines of more than $4,000 at a time when purse strings are already being tightened. That isn't going to work. A 2023 study shows that around 30% of Russians who are planning to have children before Putin's invasion have either postponed or given up on their plans entirely. Why? Well, the country's combination of social issues and terrible economic position make them feel like it's impossible for them to have families. And Russia's economic woes have only grown larger since then. But that doesn't seem to be the case on the surface. Russia forecasts gross domestic product growth of 3.9% in 2024, 0.3% higher than its 2023 growth in November. It's likely to hit that figure or thereabouts, which would suggest that Russia is a country on the economic rise. The problem is that practically all of its growth is being fueled by the war effort, and it's the everyday Russian Putin is relying upon to have children who are being hit the hardest. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly points out that international sanctions on Russia since the beginning of Putin's invasion have led to a decline in exports and an unstable ruble. The Atlantic Council also says that Russia's economy is in severe danger of overheating thanks to massive interest rates and difficult-to-control inflation. Russia's central bank defied expectations in December 2024 by keeping the country's base interest rate at 21% rather than increasing it by 200 points to 23%, as many thought it would. That's little solace for the everyday Russian who now finds it practically impossible to borrow money at a reasonable rate, to afford homes or even the smallest of luxuries. These borrowing problems are compounded by higher inflation, which was one of the reasons so many expected a base interest rate increase in the first place. By the end of 2024, Russia's inflation was as high as 9.5%, naturally leading to increased costs for everyday goods, even as Putin splashes the cash to try and keep his war machine running. Russia may be paying its soldiers more than ever before, but that doesn't mean much when the cost of living is so high that the wage increase offers nothing. Worse yet, these inflation figures mark some of the worst that Russia's potential child-having couples have to worry about. Putin has been accused of spending too much money on guns and forgetting about butter, according to Radio Free Europe. Russia's leader denies that allegation, of course he does. But he can't hide from the fact that the rising cost of butter in Russia has led to a price increase of 33% on produce since the start of 2024. That's more than triple the country's inflation rate, and it underpins the problem that Russian couples have in their own country. They can barely afford to feed themselves, never mind the male children Putin wants them to have to make up for his massive losses in Ukraine. So where does all of this leave Russia? The country has already lost over 1% of its male population and is on track to break 2% if the end of 2024 casualty rates keep up. It's experiencing these losses after having already lost around 500,000 of its men in an exodus that took place at the beginning of the war. And though Russia is just barely having more male babies than it's losing men in the war, daily male death rates exceeding birth rates are becoming an increasingly common occurrence. All of this is set against a backdrop in which Putin is attempting to punish would-be families for not having children, even as nearly a third of those families have already decided to postpone or cancel their plans. Russia's economic issues add further pressure, with the rising cost of consumer goods and borrowing making even more Russians think twice about having children. Putin has created a multi-generational problem in Russia's male population. It will take decades for Russia to recoup the losses to the male population it's experienced as a consequence of Putin's special military operation, and no amount of coercion from the president or national programs to encourage people to have children will change that fact. But what do you think about Russia losing over 1% of its male population to the Ukraine war? How will Putin fix this problem, assuming a solution even exists? What does this population loss mean for Russia's future? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Putin is Finished as Russian losses in Ukraine skyrocket, or click this other video instead.